Hey friends, welcome back to Evolve or Die. Today we're back basically just going over the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act. This was signed into law by Biden just yesterday on the 17th. And we're going to talk about what impacts this bill is supposed to have on inflation. If any, we're going to talk about what is comprised of this bill, what are the main focuses, and we're also going to take a look at the breakdown of spending and the breakdowns of recent investments that we've seen enacted because of this act. So a summary, kind of just a rundown of what's included in this bill. I've listed here in front of the screen, but I want to start with just touching on how inflation has impacted all of us over the last couple of years. Now, of course, there's different measures of inflation when you're looking at the tech sector, when you're looking at, manufacturing industries. Their measures of inflations look very different than on the consumer inflation side. So they're looking at material input costs. They're looking at supply chain deficits. On our side, on the consumer side, what drives our inflation is increase in M2 money supply, which we saw a 40% increase of because of the $1.1 trillion COVID Relief Act that was infiltrated into circulation. Another thing that contributes to the consumer inflation is just increases in our basic consumer needs. That includes cost of living, rent, that includes energy costs, our electricity, utilities, that includes groceries and food and, just transportation and all other basic necessities that make up our consumer needs. So when you hear certain groups or certain economists referring to inflation, there are different kinds of inflation that affect different sectors differently. So we're mostly going to be focusing on a breakdown of this bill and why it's called the Inflation Reduction Act. And yeah, so we have a breakdown here of just kind of what's to be expected, what's to be covered, what is to be addressed in terms of legislation in this bundle. And the reason that I wanted to give a little bit of background about inflation is because we are technically in a recession. We have seen 2 negative quarters of negative GDP growth consecutively. So we are in a recession. No matter if the Federal Reserve decides to change the definition of a recession in the upcoming future, that remains to be seen. But here we have it. This is a breakdown. This is a summary. We have plans to decrease the deficit. We have plans to basically supplement more investments in domestic energy production. And we're going to talk a little bit about the EV tax credits and clean energy incentives that are going to be also included in this bill. We're going to see reduced drug costs under the Affordable Prescription Care Act. And we're going to talk a little bit about the 15% corporate minimum tax, as well as increased funding for IRS infrastructure and what that means for the middle class and the tax brackets that this is going to impact the most. So the largest portion of this bill is being allocated to climate provisions and clean energy incentives. So again, just a summary of what this looks like. We are attempting to decrease spending on domestic energy productions. This would be the largest climate investment made by any administration in the history of our country. And there are really ambitious goals outlined and structured to reduce carbon emissions at least 40% by 2031. And there are quite a few provisions to allocate investments to lower income environments just to reduce environmental issues and environmental injustices. So there are many people that are calling this bill a climate bill in disguise. I mean, the bulk of the funding is being allocated to climate change. We needed to see this happen. If we would like to address all of the other issues that we have in the world and in the country, a good place to start would be to make sure that we have an environment to thrive in. So I mean, these are provisions that needed to be taken. The way our society has functioned as a developed nation has been on a quite unsustainable path for quite a few decades in terms of environmental decay. So we are going to see the bulk of the funding that's included going to climate provisions. And another huge element and component of this bill is focused around decreased prescription drug costs. So we're going to see Medicare expanding benefits. This is going to include free vaccines. This is going to include insulin caps. This is going to include placing a ceiling or a cap for out-of-pocket drug costs, estimated at about $4,000 or less by 2024. So this is, going to affect a select group of the population. If you do qualify for Medicare, and this is a benefit that you use, that's definitely something that's very substantial, being that insulin is a very, very common needed drug for diabetics, and it's very, very expensive. So it's always good to see improvements made in the healthcare sector. And again, this is also under another Medicare expansion plan, but an average saved is estimated to be about $800 a year per enrollee. And this is also enables them to negotiate about 100 drugs over the next decade. That'll basically force drug companies to rebate the customers in the event that the prices are outpacing inflation. So you can expect, if you're overpaying for your prescription drug costs through 2024, that you'll at least possibly see a rebate on a lot of the different common drugs that are needed, but are often very expensive. We're going to see a lot of EV tax incentives. You can see I didn't add anything to my slide here. I have it all up here for you, though. There are going to be quite a few tax breaks that include clean energy support. So we're going to see $7,500 tax credits for many EV drivers, electric vehicles. We're going to see tax breaks if you have clean energy modifications done to your home. We're going to see a lot of incentivizing being environmentally friendly. And this is going to umbrella across the corporate world and our consumerist society. So if you have had any kind of like clean energy modifications, if you've had solar panels added to your roof, anything like that, I would definitely look into the next tax season, like what kind of incentives that you can write off and what kind of tax breaks that you can get for participating in the clean energy space. So we are going to see, again, like I said, the bulk of this allocated bill, the funding is mostly allocated to clean energy movements and initiatives. So we're going to look at a breakdown of exactly how the bill is being funded, how much revenue has been raised already, and just kind of a breakdown of how this is being funded. So we have total revenue raised in capital. We have 15% corporate minimum tax provisions accounting for $222 billion. We have the prescription drug pricing reform accounting for $265 billion. We have IRS tax enforcement provisions accounting for $124 billion. And we have 1% stock buybacks at $74 billion and loss limitation extensions at $52 billion. So there are quite a few of these that are impacting corporations the most. The 15% corporate minimum tax is definitely an idea that has been recirculated throughout history. Like we've seen this enacted by many administrations. And I think the stipulations right now remain, if you are a company that generates over $1 billion in revenue, you're going to be paying a 15% minimum tax. So we've seen, again, $222 billion in funding for this bill coming directly from corporate minimum taxes. So we love to see that. We love to see taxation falling on corporations rather than on the shoulders of basic consumers. So we do like to see that. The total investments that we've generated, again, and how they've been allocated. So we are going to see 369 billion being allocated to energy security and climate change. The Affordable Care Act extension, that is going to basically be funding all of our prescription drug costs decreased, and our Western Drought Resiliency Funding. This is something that I'm actually not particularly versed in. I do know that it is fiscal funding, which means that it's funded by taxpayers. So I don't have too much info on how that portion of the funding is being allocated or what exactly is being used for. But yeah, this is kind of a breakdown of how it's being funded. Where are these funds being allocated? How are they being dispersed? What is the whole focus of the bill? Something else that I also neglected to mention that honestly has me a little bit alarmed because of how much funding is being allocated to the IRS. There's a proposed 80 billion in this bill that is being allocated to increasing the IRS's auditing force. Now, what they've said about this is households under 400,000 shouldn't be concerned because they're not coming for us, right? They're coming for, if you're in a tax bracket that's over 400,000, there's going to be like increased auditing. The reason I think this is not true and that middle income tax brackets are going to be impacted the most is because just think of the basic, rebuttals and the basic person when they're filling out their taxes versus somebody that's in a $400,000 plus tax bracket, right? When you're being audited or when you're being pursued by the IRS, there's a certain level of resource disparities that if you're in a less than $400,000 tax bracket, you're not going to have access to. You're not going to have a team of lawyers to fight an audit, an unjust audit. Like what I think this is going to prompt, I think this is going to prompt a lot more lower income and middle income bracket households being audited by the IRS about, tax returns that they filed 3 to 5 years ago. And they're saying the exact opposite of this is going to be the impact, but I don't think that's true, just because the history of the IRS, like they've always been grossly underfunded. So to see 80 billion funneling in right after we had a wave of unprecedented retail investors entering the stock market, we had unprecedented cryptocurrency millionaires made out of regular persons and of regular means. I think they're hiring this massive wave and allocating this funding to specifically the auditing portion of the IRS. I think it's going to be another silent tax, just how inflation was, right? In 2020, we saw $1 trillion in stimulus injected into the economy, and what immediately followed? Inflation, a silent tax. All of your consumer items, the cost of living, the air that you breathe, the water that you drink, the electricity that you use, everything just silently got more and more and more expensive until, it's basically unaffordable. So we see this in cycles, and we see a lot of cause and effect, right? So you cannot create a surplus of funds by 40% of what has historically been in circulation with no repercussions. And you cannot have unprecedented cheap corporate debt and not feel the ramifications that we're all feeling right now. And I only think it's going to get worse because most of this bill is fiscal spending. So that means more silent taxes. And of course, they don't say inflation is a tax while your wages disproportionately lag with the increased cost of living. So I call it a silent tax. I I think all of the money that they're allocating to the IRS, I think that's going to be increased auditing for, again, I think it's going to be auditing for lower and middle income tax brackets, because we don't have the resources. We don't have the resources to fight the IRS. So I think that's the direction that we're heading. We're going to be more silently taxed through audits. I think that's exactly what's coming. So the key takeaways that I really want to kind of just really get into. Sorry, I closed my screen there. Let me pull this back up so I can get you guys my final thoughts. Essentially, my final thoughts are based on many economist reports and analyst reportings, we're not going to see any substantial impact on inflation. We're not going to see any kind of substantial like fall in GDP. We're not going to see an increase in GDP for at least a decade from what's being projected here. And again, as I said earlier, there is a lot of crucial legislation that's bundled up in this bill. But I do think that calling it an Inflation Reduction Act is basically clickbait. That's just how I look at it. Again, the future of tax auditing for regular civilians, just how I've seen things unfold, how historically inflation follows very tense global socio-political relations with everything that's going on in Ukraine and Russia and the China-Taiwan situation. I think more silent taxes are coming our way. And the corporate tax bill that we've seen, of course, this is a good thing. We like to see this, but the problem with the corporate tax structure is it always starts out at a really high revenue bracket. So right now, the provisions are if you're a corporation generating $1 billion in revenue, you're going to have a 15% minimum corporate tax. But what happens is a couple years go by, that $1 billion in revenue gets dropped down to like 500 million. That 500 million in revenue gets dropped to 100 million, and then it trickles down all the way to small business owners. So as we've seen throughout history, trickle down economics, it only ever fails. It always trickles down in the worst ways, with tax burdens falling on the people that can least sustain it, and increased fiscal government spending. Also, just basic economics 101. The government spends more, our taxes go up. It's just econ 101. But those are kind of my thoughts about this. There is not going to be a substantial impact on inflation, even though there was a lot of important legislation that got bundled into this. There are some things that I'm not thrilled to see. And that's a little bit about that. If you guys tune in a couple of days here this weekend, I'll have some more info for you. I'll do another poll if you guys would like to know more about the China-Taiwan situation, or we can go more into the US housing market correcting itself. We can do that. So thanks for tuning in, keep evolving, and hit the subscribe button.